Park Ranger Andy Brown with Washoe County Regional Parks and Open Space. I'm the Park Ranger here at Galena Creek Regional Park, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about snakes. This is a general overview of information regarding snakes in general, but I'll talk a little bit about a couple native species that we have in our area, specifically gopher snakes. I know a lot of folks have questions out there about how to identify a gopher snake versus a rattlesnake. Are gopher snakes bad? And how can you protect yourself when you're out there hiking on the trail? I know that's always on the forefront. It's a big question that I get a lot. So Simply Snakes is the name of my program. Snake is a limbless reptile. They're ectotherms and they have dry, scaly skin. They rely on the sun to stay warm. They're not ingesting food like we are to burn calories to stay warm. They really need the sun's heat to stay warm. And there are around 3,000 different species of snakes living in all sorts of habitats all around the world, except for Antarctica and the Arctic Circle. You're not going to find them around the North or South Poles, fortunately. So why are snakes so important to us as humans? Well, they are predators and prey. They're somewhere in the middle of the food chain, if you will, and they feed on many harmful bugs. They're also a big vector control for us in regard to rodents and controlling rodents around our house. Why is that so important, though? They will protect us as humans from things like hantavirus and bubonic plague. In a place like Galena, where you have the mice and the ground squirrels cohabitating, they can trade vectors, if you will. So you might have mice out there that are carrying the plague, and squirrels that may have hantavirus that they might be able to spread. So snakes are super important because they're helping to control the populations of those predators out there. A snake can sense vibrations. They don't have very good hearing. So if you took your fingers and put them in your ears and just said a couple of words, that's what it seems like to a snake to hear. So they feel through their skin, and they have organs in their heads that sense the vibrations, and that's how they hear. They also use infrared to locate food. So just like the little mouse on the screen there, that's kind of what a snake sees when it sees a prey item that's got a warm body temperature. So they smell with their tongues. They've got very specialized sensory cells on their tongues that enable them to smell as they're sticking their tongues out. So if you ever see a snake in the wild doing its thing, or you go to PetSmart and you see a snake in the terrariums there, when you see them sticking their tongues out, what they're doing is they're smelling you. The study of snakes is called herpetology. Snakes have flexible jaws that enables them to eat their food whole. So if a snake finds a mouse, it will eat that thing whole. It's not going to chew it up into little bite-sized pieces, and so it'll actually ingest it whole. Most snakes are similar to birds and other reptiles, other animals that are cold-blooded, and they lay eggs. A few of them do give live birth, and I'm actually going to show you one of those species while we're going through this. So the longest snake in the world is the reticulated python. They live in Asia, and the largest recorded one is 33 feet long. So to give you a sense of how long 33 feet is, it's about 10 paces. And that is the length of the longest or largest recorded reticulated python in Asia. So hopefully you don't have to worry about finding these in your backyard in this area. We do have some pretty large snakes. The gopher snakes can get pretty large, but nothing like these guys. These are typically going to be in tropical climates of the world. And the smallest snake in the world is a thread snake, and they usually grow to less than 4 inches long. So, I mean, that's about 4 inches, my index finger there. And that's a tiny little snake. They're pretty easily confused for your average earthworms. And even smaller rubber boas, which we have here in northern Nevada, you might see those after they've emerged from their mamas in the springtime. When they are juveniles, they often appear to be the same shape and size and color even of a very large earthworm, and they're often confused for those, and unfortunately it makes it really hard for them to defend themselves because of that. These are kind of a couple of examples of how snakes have adapted to their camouflage themselves. The Asian vine snake, it's very thin and kind of oval-shaped profile if you looked at them straight on, and very colorful, just like the Brazilian rainbow and the tree python. Those guys, they have very bright colorings in order to blend into their environments in some aspects, and sometimes they want to stand out. So they have a lot of adaptations. The autumn adder, it's got a very spiked scales. You see the scales on this guy right here. I mean, he likes to blend into his environment and look just like a lot of the shrubbery or vegetation that he's going to be living in. So it's pretty typical of snakes and a lot of other reptiles to have that adaptation. This is just kind of a general breakdown of the snake anatomy. I won't go too in-depth into it because it's really hard to see the detail from my slide, but they've got you notice on this slide, this guy has fangs, and so this is going to be typical of a venomous snake. Non-venomous snakes tend to not have fangs because there's absolutely no purpose in a non-venomous snake to have the fangs. So if you see a snake out there and you're curious as to whether or not it may be venomous or not, I don't encourage you to pick it up and look at it and check its mouth for fangs, but if you happen to see fangs, if it happens to open its mouth and you can see inside and you can see it has or doesn't have fangs, that will answer that question for you. This is kind of a good demonstration here to tell you the difference between the typical rattlesnake and the common gopher snakes that you might see in our area. We have Pacific gopher snakes. That's the main variety of gopher snake that we have in northern Nevada here, and we're kind of in a range where we have a few different species that we might find, but the Pacific gopher snakes are the most common ones. And as far as rattlesnakes go, we normally see Great Basin rattlesnakes. We're kind of north of the range where you would typically find things like Mojave greens or sidewinders, the more aggressive, more dangerous species of rattlesnakes. The Great Basin rattlesnake is still a pretty dangerous species to encounter out on the trail, but they're definitely a lot more passive, and they're not as aggressive, and they really want nothing to do with you. If you are able to circumvent them and find a path out, they're not going to tend to go after you like the Mojave greens or the sidewinders might. One big way that you can tell the difference between the two, the rattlesnake has this very typical triangular shape to its head, and that's a key feature in a rattlesnake. That's one thing you will notice right away about a rattlesnake, is that it's got this triangular shaped head. The gopher snake's head is a lot more, it's narrower and elongated, and it's more like the size and shape of the rest of the snake. So You know, they have very similar patterns, and this slide is not a very good demonstration of the main difference between the appearance of a gopher snake and a rattlesnake. But a rattlesnake will tend to have a more dull, muddled pattern, where a gopher snake will have a bright, shiny pattern, and they're very contrasting compared to the rattlesnake. The other main difference is, of course, the buttons on the tail. And this guy here has 6 buttons, technically, so they're born with one, so they can rattle right after they emerge from their eggs. They can go right to it, and so they can start rattling right away. And they'll grow a rattle every time they shed their skin. You know, some folks say that they will grow a button every year, and it really depends on the species. You know, if they shed more often, they might end up growing more buttons than other species of snakes. The Great Basin rattler, I think they'll average like 1 button of growth per year. But the gopher snake has a couple of things that it will do to adapt, again, to make it look like it's a rattlesnake. They want you to think that they're dangerous if you were to walk upon them, especially if you catch them by surprise. And the reason is not that they want to harm you, but they're doing it to protect themselves. And they will actually hold their breath, and their head will flatten out, and that will mimic the look of a rattlesnake when they do that. And they'll actually shake their tails too. If you see a gopher snake and you happen to startle him, he'll hiss. They have a very loud hiss, and that hissing sound is sort of an emulation of the rattlesnake's buttons shaking, and just the shaking of the tail itself, and the fact that they may have coiled up in a striking type position similar to a rattlesnake. They really want you to think that they're a rattlesnake, but the immediate looking at the head and the shape of the head and the tail, that will tell you right away. Sometimes if a gopher snake is getting ready to shed, their pattern will start to dull a little bit, so you can't look at that as like a telltale, oh yeah, that's a gopher snake or a rattlesnake. Usually you'll hear a rattlesnake before you see one. So when you're out there hiking, I recommend keep all your senses. A lot of people will like to put in their AirPods or their earbuds, and they'll go out there and listen to a podcast or they'll listen to music as they're hiking. But it's really a good idea to use all of your senses and keep them as you're going along, because your sense of hearing is extremely important when it comes to warning you of the presence of a snake, because often you're going to hear them before you see them. Can you tell the difference? Can anybody watching this video actually tell the difference between these two? I'll bring a friend of mine out. But this is a Pacific gopher snake. This is the typical one that you'll see in northern Nevada, and you can see how he's got a very bright pattern, and his head is very similar to the size of the rest of his body, and you don't see the buttons on the tail there. That is a typical rattlesnake, and this is kind of in a striking position there. So if you see them kind of coiled up like that, they are getting ready to jump out at you. So you can see the telltale buttons on the tail there. Snake safety. You want to be smart. Watch where you stop and reach. Don't approach or pick up a snake if you're not sure what kind of snake it is. Like I said, don't pick up the snake and check its mouth for fangs to make sure it's not venomous. But it's a good idea to wear pants and sturdy boots when you're out there hiking the trails for obvious other reasons too, but it's a really good defense from a snake bite. If a rattlesnake does happen to strike at you, having a decent thick layer on your legs might help protect you from from a bite, and it might make it less severe. Snakes are rarely aggressive, but they are defensive. So this is my friend Dodger. He is about a 3-year-old Pacific gopher snake, and he's the office mascot. So little backstory on Dodger. The reason he has that name was a lady who had discovered him coiled up underneath the hood of her vehicle was able to capture him and save him from being harmed, but she didn't really have a way to care for him, so they always call the park ranger, because the park ranger always knows what to do with the wildlife. So, but I was happy to take him. He's very well behaved. Gopher snakes are actually really easy to keep as pets, believe it or not. But I don't recommend it if you're not super experienced with keeping reptiles as pets. But Dodger's pretty easily kept. So yeah, you can kind of see the contrast there in his pattern. It's very dark and light, so it's not muddled so much. And it's been a few weeks since the last time he shed, but his scales are still pretty bright. It can be difficult to tell the difference between a rattlesnake and a gopher snake just based on whether their scales are bright versus dull, just because they might be in a transition period where they might be getting ready to shed. But you see him sticking his tongue out there? He's actually smelling me. And he's very comfortable with this. He doesn't get too bothered by much. And gopher snakes, they can be somewhat moody, but he seems to be happy here. He is very particular, though, just like some dogs per se. I know a lot of dogs will be like one person pets, and Dodger seems to have kind of adopted that trait. He doesn't like everybody, and so depending on the person, he might decide that he might want to get a little defensive, and you might get to see his defensive pose and hear him hiss and shake his tail. But you see, he doesn't have any buttons on his tail, and when he's fully lengthed out, when he's stretched out completely, he's about this long, so about 3.5, 4 feet long. And he eats. He's got a very voracious appetite. Actually, he'll eat a dead mouse probably about once a week. He would eat every day, non-stop, if I let him. That's how voracious their appetites are. But they can go several weeks and months actually without eating. So their metabolisms can slow down, and they're kind of vigorous during the summertime, during the warm months, just because the days are so much longer, and they can be out and they can be out hunting and covering a lot of ground for a lot longer during the daytime, and they will actually hibernate during the winter time. So their metabolisms will slow down, and they'll find a nice place to overwinter, and they can go, like I said, several months without eating another meal. So that was actually my experience with him here in the office. He refused to eat anything after about mid-October, and didn't have his first meal again until about early March. So I'm going to go ahead and put Dodger back in, and I will grab his friend. Introduce you to David Bowie, the rubber boa. So this is my other office mascot. This is a rubber boa, and a young lady at the campfire program named him David Bowie, and I think it sticks. So David Bowie is about a 2.5 to 3-year-old rubber boa. So he's still kind of a juvenile. He's starting to grow into the adult stage, and you can tell that based on his color. He's kind of a dark olive color. Juvenile rubber boas will tend to be a lot more of a pinkish tone. So if he was a young guy, you almost might not be able to see him here on my arm. He'd be very similar color, but you can see that their pattern extremely monotone. They don't really have any serious breakup features on their patterns, but their underbellies are kind of a lighter tone. You can see there. So his scales are usually always very glossy, and unlike the gopher snakes, this guy is nocturnal. So gopher snakes, many other snake species in northern Nevada are diurnal. This guy's nocturnal, so he's going to be doing most of his hunting at night. So you might get the experience of seeing one of these out on the trail if you're up here around 7 or 8 p.m. They like to be out in the evening hours, and you might even see one early morning. But the hottest times of the day, they're usually under a rock, and they usually like to stay out of sight. And their typical diet is normally going to be something like a mouse. Also, you can see he's kind of snuggling into my hand. He's pretty comfortable with this. Their appetite's not quite as voracious as the gopher snake. This guy will eat maybe once every few months. He might be able to eat every couple of weeks, but his metabolism's quite a bit slower than the typical snake that you might see, even garter snakes or racers. He's kind of a slow mover. So you might see these guys alongside the roads quite a bit, because they don't tend to make going across the road very easily. But one defense mechanism that they have, one adaptation, you see his tail there, looks very similar to his head. And the reason that is an adaptation or a defense is because if they feel like they're going to be harmed, they'll hide their heads and they'll stick their tails up, and they'll use their tail to mimic the motions of their head. And if their tail gets picked up by a bird, or snapped by a coyote or something, they're not going to die. They'll recover from that. The other thing that's notable about David Bowie is, as I'd mentioned before, there are a few snakes that actually give live birth as opposed to hatching from an egg, and this is one of those species. So they'll actually have up to 20 young, and they take about 3 years to grow to maturity, and they'll live about 15-20 years out in the wild. So it's pretty common to see these guys get pretty good size. The other really beneficial thing, other than the rodent control aspect that snakes have, these are actually used for therapy. So people that are deathly afraid of snakes might benefit from being around a rubber boa, because these guys are extremely docile, and they're actually used for therapy for people that are extremely afraid of snakes. So, well, I am extremely glad to have been a part of this video, and I'm glad that I was able to talk about snakes today, and I hope some of you might have learned a few things about the differences between rattlesnakes and gopher snakes. If you're ever in the neighborhood, please feel free to knock on the door and say hi, and you might get a chance to take David Bowie out for a little walk on your own.